Kyle Bass, thank you very much for your time.
Great to be here, Sharri.
You've been following the detention of Australian journalist and mother Cheng Lei in China, and you say that if a Westerner is living in China, they should get out while they can, and the same situation for investors in Chinese equities, bonds or private equity. Why do you say this? Why should people get out of China?
Well, I mean, you look back to the hostage diplomacy that Xi Jinping engaged in 2021 when he obviously detained the Canadians, Coburg and Spaver, in kind of an effort to release Huawei's Meng from the clutches of the Canadians who were holding her on behalf of Americans who were about to extradite her and take her through a long, lengthy, and embarrassing trial of contravening U.S. sanctions. So I think when a sovereign engages in obvious hostage diplomacy, that is the red flag to be worried about traveling there. And if you go to the U.S. State Department's website, they're advising against Americans' travel to the mainland China and to Hong Kong, stipulating that there could be arbitrary detentions, there could be exit bans on your visa, there could be all kinds of, call it arbitrary and capricious detentions and potentially incarcerations. I mean, I don't know why you would ever subject yourself to a country that engages in that behavior.
And even for Chinese businessmen, you know, what happened to Jack Ma as well. Now, Chinese President Xi Jinping's lifetime goal seems to be the reunification of Taiwan. I mean, we speak to a lot of people on this program from a national security perspective, but not an economic one. What impact would a Taiwan invasion have on the world economy?
Well, Sharri, as you know, I come to the world from an economics background, but when you think about what an invasion of Taiwan by Xi Jinping's China would mean to the world, economically, we all know that it would be a pretty substantial shock initially. And I've seen many, many different, let's say, prognostications as to what the extent of that shock might be. My own view and our firm's view is it would be a shock to global GDP of 1.5% to 2%. Of GDP, which is a pretty significant global recession. But I do think that the West would immediately finish, let's just say, reshoring and changing the supply chains as quickly as they can to make the necessary adjustments. You and I have both seen these adjustments being made in real time over the last 2 years. If you look at the number of mentions of reshoring, onshoring, and all of the associated words, they've moved up parabolically in mentions, and you can see what's happening around the globe. Now, there are those companies that refuse to admit that this is even a potential possibility, and those companies will lose, you know, the PP&E they have invested in China. They may have their, in the event this happens, they may have their employees detained, and they will lose whatever supply chain capacity they have there, and therefore significant revenue. But, you know, the writing's been on the Great Wall for many years, Sharri, and those that are remaining and turning a blind eye to the facts that as they exist today will end up paying the price.
You famously predicted the subprime mortgage crisis. I want to ask you about your predictions now on the time frame for a Chinese invasion of Taiwan and therefore the flow-on global recession that you say would come with that.
Yeah, well, as you probably know, just a few weeks ago, I gave a briefing at the Hudson Institute in D.C. and to send U.S. Senior military leadership. And the way that I think about that timeline, that's right. That's exactly right. Miles and I, the Hudson Institute just formed the China Center. Miles runs the China Center, myself, Secretary Pompeo, and even a former Australian PM, Scott Morrison, sit on that board. And I think that when you look at the timing of the potential invasion, I look at it from three buckets. The first bucket is the military and force bucket. which I work with the U.S. military on. The second bucket is, what is China doing on the mainland in their legal system? What are they building in the mainland? How are they working day and night on mainland in preparation for a potential invasion? And the third bucket is the economic side. What are they doing in financial markets that make, let's say, that don't make economic sense? And all three of those buckets are filling up pretty quickly. I'm happy to share that presentation with you on Twitter, Sharri, and I'll send it over there. But the point being, I think that this invasion happens in the next 2 years. Now, Xi Jinping has said he wants his military ready for an invasion by 2027. But we all know that as China sits today, their economy continues to circle the drain. We see today, we see Country Garden suspending a number of its RMB-based bonds, its dollar-based bonds. There are, call it 180 billion of Chinese property developers in default today, which is about 71% of the offshore bonds. You've got youth unemployment somewhere between 20 and 50%. You've got the Chinese real estate sector in an essential collapse. And that real estate represents about a third of Chinese GDP. So you've got China's economy in a very precarious situation after decades of meteoric growth, and some can say debt-fueled, irresponsible growth. And that couples with the fact that Xi Jinping's mission, life's mission, as he said in his speeches since 2017, is that reunification of what he calls the Taiwanese separatists. So I think this all presents a formula for a pretty negative global event. It's something that you don't want, I don't want. It's something I'm not hoping for. But it sure looks like Xi Jinping is hell-bent on making this happen, and his economic woes may accelerate the timetable.
Do you think there's a political leadership in the US, whether it's Biden or Trump, who's in the White House, that would act as more of a deterrent for this happening, for Xi Jinping making that decision to invade or reunify with Taiwan? And also, do you think that business investment ties and business relationships have meant that Western governments have been more reluctant to stand up to Xi Jinping on a variety of issues, whether it's the origins of COVID-19 or whether it's citizens like Cheng Lei being held in detention?
Yeah, that is a great question, Sharri. And you're right about this spans the political spectrum. It's both Republicans and Democrats in America really haven't been willing to stand up to China. I would say the crowning foreign policy achievement of the Biden administration happened October 7th, 2022, when he implemented the sweeping export restrictions on specific technologies that might assist the Chinese military in building their military machine against the United States and against the West. And since then, Sharri, what you've seen is the K Street, and that is code for basically the think tanks and lobbyists in the United States working to lessen those sanctions because U.S. corporate interests continue to want to do business in China and want to make those profits at the end of that 1.4 billion person Chinese rainbow. And in the end, what we have is the private sector and China Inc. lobbying the U.S. administrations in, let's say, some legal and potentially some illegal ways to lessen those sanctions on China, lessen the difficulties on China. And you've seen that since October 7th of 2022, the Biden administration has really gone weak. And Sharri, I sit here in London. I sit here in the Tigris and Euphrates of the resistance that was built during World War II against two madmen back then. We had Hitler and Mussolini building a powerful force in the 1930s. And I believe that today's world, I don't know where today's Churchill is. I can tell you he is not in the Biden administration, and he was not in the Trump administration. We have people like Mike Gallagher in the U.S. Congress. We need a Thatcher. We need a Churchill. We need a Reagan. We need someone that understands peace through strength, peace through weakness, peace through appeasement with madmen like Xi Jinping and Putin has never worked. And that's what I'm most fearful of. I think we need real leadership in the West, and we need to find someone quickly.
Well, you just mentioned Mike Gallagher. I actually flew to Canberra to interview him on Friday. Do you think Mike Gallagher could be such a figure?
Yeah, I mean, I have a very high opinion of Mike. Mike's a friend of mine, and he has the ability to really elucidate himself beautifully and to understand what the operative issues are in any major argument and really think. I think he thinks across the partisan spectrum in a bipartisan way, and he thinks about national security first. And while the last 2 decades of the world were all about economics and growth and finance, I think where we sit today at a hinge in history, and the next 2 decades or so will be solely focused on the national security of the West and the battle between the rules-based order and let's just say morality and let's say the axis of evil that sits between Putin's Russia, Xi's China, and North Korea, Iran, Venezuela, and the rest. So you see those chasms widening, and it's important that someone like Mike Gallagher, someone with a proper bipartisan head on their shoulder that understands where the forces of evil are, needs to again rise to the top. And I would love to work with someone like Mike on these issues in the future.
Just quickly on this topic, what's your view on why Wall Street and Hollywood have kowtowed to China to the extent that they have? I mean, we even saw it with the most recent Barbie movie. Yeah,
it's again a great comment, Sharri. I think what you see in China being very tactful in kind of ingratiating themselves and buying their way into Hollywood. But also at the same time, not just simply buying directly into Hollywood, but when movies are released, if they don't have the ability to be shown in China, it may cut the movie's revenue in half or by a third. And so all of Hollywood wants Chinese access. And in exchange for Chinese access, they have to be willing to kowtow to the Chinese or to simply do whatever the Chinese say you have to do. You think about the Cold War. In the Cold War, we all knew who the bad guys were. We all knew Russia was the bad guy. And in fact, many of Hollywood's movies had Russian villains as the bad guys. When was the last time you saw a movie made with a Chinese villain? They're not made. And the reason they're not made is they will never show in China. And Hollywood and corporate America have greed as their governing principle. And trust me, you don't want corporate America or Hollywood running the national security complex in either Australia or the US or the UK or Europe writ large, because we'll all be speaking Chinese and Russian the next day. I think it's important for us, again, to find leadership to say, we're not going to do this anymore. We're not going to allow China to buy their way into Hollywood and influence Western politicians.
Such strong comments. Kyle Bass, I just want to ask you about the origins of COVID-19. I know you pay special attention to news reports on this issue and to the developments in Congress on this political issue. Why do you think there has been a misinformation campaign, so much censorship and cover-up over the potential for a laboratory leak? And why do you think the White House has downplayed this, the possibility that a lab leak started the pandemic?
Yeah. First of all, you wrote one of the authoritative books on this subject, Sharri, and I read it early on, and it's actually how you and I got to know each other. There are only a few books out there, I think 2, that I've read that are of any real quality, and it's yours and viral. And in your book, when you look at the chapter, "The Scientists Speak" and "The Scientists Speak," you can see, without being a scientist, that the zoonotic transmission was not even in the realm of possibility, given the way that furin cleavage site and the spike protein interacted. Again, I'm not a biologist, but I've read as much as I can to be dangerous. But I think that your question is good because you've seen recently, call it since February or March, you've seen the Biden administration take a notable turn towards, I call it the appeasement caucus, was really energized sometime early this year. And I think it was driven by John Kerry and his quest for the climate of the world. And I think that here we are talking about potentially taking 50-year promises from China in exchange for things today, climate to national security. And I think that is a grave, grave risk to us. But early on, Sharri, if you remember, the Trump administration announced that they were going to create a presidential committee to investigate the origins of COVID. Within 2 hours or so, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in China gave a press release and said, if the U.S. engages in a origin of COVID presidential commission, that China will immediately withhold antibiotics from the U.S. Now, somehow, over a very long period of time, we allowed the frog to boil in the pot, where we have allowed 95% of the active pharmaceutical ingredients, the APIs that produce antibiotics for the United States, to be made in China. In fact, the majority of them in Wuhan itself. So we immediately, the National Security Council of the U.S. turned off the origin of COVID inquiry presidential commission immediately when China threatened to withhold antibiotics. So we're dealing with, let's just say, an irresponsible global actor. We're dealing with an actor that's clearly guilty, given their cover-up at the Wuhan lab and their inability, or the inability of any global scientist to really go try to understand where that was. And you ask why now? Why now are we really downplaying it? And again, the White House has decided to go appease China and try to re-engage. I mean, look, we send our Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen to go bow to the Chinese and beg for more engagement. At the same time, when China is such an irresponsible global actor, again, our foreign policy has fallen apart. And I think, again, we need leadership, and we need leadership across the board.
Look, that was such an eloquent and such a smart answer there, Kyle Bass. Look, just lastly, before you go, putting China aside, I'd love to know your assessment on how the US economy is tracking. Do you think inflation is now under control? Are we out of the woods for stagflation or for a recession? Yeah,
I mean, I'm in the slight recession camp, and again, when you look at what the central bank of the United States did in response to COVID, we printed 40% more broad money in 18 months. You just think about that. We put 40% more money in the system in 18 months, and we also underreport inflation like the rest of the world does too. But in America, apartment rents in 2021 were up about 18%. Apartment rents in 2022, they were up about 18%. So we had rents move 40%. And you and I both know when we go either out to eat or go stay in a hotel or do whatever we do to live our lives today, the cost of life has gone up at least 40% in the last 2.5 years. And so is inflation, do we have it under control, in quotes? The price level moved from, let's just say we index it at 100 or par in 2019. By the end of 2022, it had moved to 140. It's now moved up in about, 143, 144. Could we see it move down to 142 or 139? Of course. But that price level is forever going to be plus 40. And if we get one move down, we're going to announce that we have contained inflation, that all's good, and it was just transitory. It was a transitory 40% move in inflation, and then they're going to go back to 2% growth in inflation. So what I believe is that the pattern is set. Inflation is here to stay. We might have a short deflationary period. If China invades Taiwan, we may have a sharp, quick deflationary period. We might have inflation and stagflation in that environment. We don't need to get into that here. But the point being is the long-term pattern is set where central banks will expand their balance sheets, and fiscally, look, the U.S. is going to have 5.7 to 6% of GDP fiscal deficit. Sharri, in the history of our country, we have never run fiscal deficits like that when we're at full employment, except for going into World War II where we had to. We've never had a peacetime fiscal deficit the size of we have today at full employment. So the people running our country have also kind of lost their way fiscally.
Kyle Bass, you are extraordinary. I really appreciate your time, and thank you very much for that interview.
Hey, it's an honor to be here with you.